At 76 years old, Claudia Alexander returned from her husband's funeral and found Meredith Caldwell already inside the Baltimore condo opening drawers like grief had no right to breathe. Robert Alexander had been buried only that morning, yet Meredith was on the phone with a lawyer calmly saying she has no legal claim to anything. Claudia stood in the doorway, still wearing black, still holding the folded church program in her trembling hand. That night, alone in Robert's private study, she noticed a narrow seam beneath his old writing desk, a hidden drawer. Inside were a brass key, a faded photograph of a rural farmhouse, and a note in Robert's handwriting. If they erase you after I'm gone, go back to Ashford Hollow. The truth is still buried there. If you believe a forgotten widow can still rise, reclaim her dignity, and uncover justice, stay with Claudia's story until the very end. For 38 years, Claudia Alexander believed grief would be the hardest thing she would ever survive. She was wrong. Grief, she would soon learn, was quiet. It arrived in waves and empty chairs and untouched coffee mugs and the scent of Robert's wool coats still hanging beside the hallway closet. It was painful, yes, but grief did not humiliate her. People did. The morning after Robert Alexander's funeral, rain slid slowly down the tall windows of the Baltimore condo, while Claudia sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the untouched bowl of oatmeal she had made out of habit. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a cup of cold tea. The apartment no longer felt like home. Not after Meredith Caldwell walked through it like a woman inspecting property she already owned. "She doesn't need all this," Meredith whispered to her husband Grant while removing framed photographs from the living room shelves. "Half these things should have been thrown away years ago." Claudia heard every word. She said nothing. At 76 years old, silence had become her survival instinct. Meredith moved confidently through the condo in expensive heels, carrying folders and legal envelopes beneath one arm. She had Robert's sharp cheekbones and dark eyes, but none of his softness. Robert had spent decades trying to bridge the distance between his daughter and his wife, but the gap had only widened with time. To Meredith, Claudia had always been temporary. An outsider. A replacement for the mother she lost young. And now, Robert was gone. There was no reason left to pretend kindness. "Derek says we should finalize the transfer before the end of the month," Meredith said casually while scrolling through her phone. Grant nodded from the dining room. "Good. The market's still decent." Claudia looked up slowly. "Transfer?" she asked quietly. Meredith sighed as if exhausted by the question. The condo Claudia. The way she said her first name felt cold and deliberate. "Never Mom. Never family. Maintaining this place isn't realistic anymore," Meredith continued. "And honestly, you shouldn't be alone after everything that's happened." Claudia felt something tighten painfully inside her chest. Robert had been dead for 17 hours. 17. And already they were discussing her future like she was furniture left behind after an estate sale. "This was Robert's home," Claudia whispered. Meredith crossed her arms. "It was my father's property." The sentence landed harder than a slap. Grant immediately looked away uncomfortable, but he did not interrupt his wife. He rarely did. Claudia lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth Robert had bought during a trip to Vermont 20 years earlier. Suddenly, every object in the condo felt fragile, temporary, disposable. She remembered the early years of her marriage when Robert used to leave handwritten notes beside the coffee maker before leaving for work. "Don't forget your umbrella, sweetheart. Dinner at 7. You make this place feel alive." Back then, Meredith was in college and rarely visited. But over the years, especially after Robert retired, Meredith began appearing more often. At first it seemed innocent family dinners, holiday visits, small favors. Then came the paperwork, the help with finances, the private meetings behind closed doors. Robert became quieter during his final year. Claudia noticed it, though he always denied something was wrong. "Just tired," he would say gently. But she remembered nights when he stood alone near the balcony window after midnight, staring into the city lights with worry carved deep into his face. And twice he mentioned a place called Ashford Hollow. The first time happened nearly 15 years earlier during a summer thunderstorm. The power had gone out, and they sat together by candlelight while rain hammered against the windows. Robert had gone strangely distant. My father used to say a man's worst mistakes are the ones buried closest to home, he murmured. Claudia laughed softly at the time. That sounds mysterious. Robert smiled faintly but never explained. Ashford Hollow, he said quietly. Nothing good ever stayed buried there forever. She never forgot the way his expression darkened afterward. Now sitting in the cold kitchen while Meredith removed pieces of her life one by one, Claudia suddenly remembered every strange silence Robert had carried during his final years. And for the first time, grief mixed with suspicion. By afternoon, Meredith had already begun reorganizing drawers. "I'm only trying to help," she said sharply when Claudia finally objected. "You can barely manage your medications without reminders." "That isn't true." Meredith ignored her. "Grant and I found a senior community outside Annapolis. It's safe. Quiet. They monitor residents." "Residents. Not people, not women." "Residents." Claudia's face flushed with humiliation. "I'm not helpless." "No one said you were helpless," Meredith replied, though her tone suggested exactly that. Grant cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe everybody just needs time." Meredith snapped her folder shut. "What we need is practicality." Then she walked directly into Robert's private study and closed the door behind her. Claudia's pulse quickened instantly. Robert's study had always been sacred territory. Not forbidden, but private. The room smelled of cedarwood old books and fountain pen ink. Robert spent hours there reading quietly in the evenings, and during his illness he locked the room more often. A strange unease crawled through Claudia's stomach. She waited until Meredith and Grant left near sunset before entering the study alone. The room was dim except for golden evening light spilling through the blinds. Dust floated softly through the air. Everything remained exactly where Robert left it. His glasses, his leather chair, the navy cardigan draped carefully across the armrest. Claudia's eyes filled instantly with tears. For several moments she simply stood there, unable to breathe properly. Then she noticed something unusual. One of the desk drawers was slightly uneven. Robert's antique writing desk had been handcrafted nearly 50 years earlier. He cherished it obsessively and polished it every winter himself. Claudia knew every scratch on its surface. But this narrow seam beneath the bottom drawer, she had never seen it before. Slowly trembling, she ran her fingers along the wood. A click echoed softly. A hidden compartment slid open. Claudia froze. Inside rested 3 objects. A brass key, a faded photograph of an old white farmhouse surrounded by dead winter fields, and a folded note. Her hands shook violently as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's. "If they erase you after I'm gone, go back to Ashford Hollow. The truth is still buried there." Claudia stared at the words while thunder rumbled faintly outside the city skyline. For the first time since Robert's death, fear replaced grief entirely. Because suddenly, deep in her heart, Claudia understood one terrible possibility. Robert had known this would happen. Claudia Alexander did not sleep that night. She sat alone in Robert's study long after midnight, the brass key clenched tightly in her hand while the faded farmhouse photograph rested beside the lamp. Ashford Hollow. The name echoed through her mind like a warning from another lifetime. Outside the condo windows, Baltimore shimmered beneath cold rain and distant ambulance sirens. The city had always comforted Claudia once. It felt alive, predictable, civilized. Now it felt dangerous, because for the first time in 38 years of marriage, she realized her husband may have died carrying secrets he never trusted anyone else to know. even her. At 3 in the morning, Claudia carefully returned the hidden drawer contents to her purse after hearing footsteps in the hallway. Meredith. The younger woman paused outside the study door before slowly opening it. "You're still awake?" Claudia straightened immediately. "Yes?" Meredith crossed her arms, her silk robe hanging neatly over sharp posture and controlled irritation. "You should try to rest." The false concern in her voice chilled Claudia more than open cruelty ever could. "I was just thinking," Claudia answered quietly. Meredith's eyes drifted briefly across Robert's desk. Searching. Claudia noticed instantly. For one dangerous second, both women understood something without saying it aloud. Meredith was looking for something specific, and Claudia suddenly knew the hidden drawer had not been meant for curiosity. It had been meant for protection. "Well," Meredith said lightly, "don't stay up too long." Then she left. Claudia listened carefully until the bedroom door down the hallway closed again. Only then did she exhale shakily. Fear settled deeper into her chest. Not fear of being alone. Fear of being trapped. The next morning, Meredith began making phone calls before breakfast. Claudia stood silently in the kitchen doorway while Meredith paced near the balcony windows speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "No, she hasn't signed yet." Pause. "I understand, Derek, but we need this finalized quickly." Another pause, then quieter. "If she starts asking questions, everything becomes complicated." Claudia's stomach tightened instantly. When Meredith noticed her standing there, she ended the call abruptly. "You startled me." "I didn't mean to." Meredith forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "Derek's just trying to help organize the estate." "The estate?" Claudia repeated softly. Meredith sighed impatiently. "Claudia, we've already discussed this." "No," Claudia answered carefully. "You discussed it. Robert died less than 2 days ago." A flicker of irritation crossed Meredith's face. Then came the colder version of her expression, the one Claudia had begun seeing more frequently during Robert's illness. Emotionless. Controlled. Someone has to make practical decisions. Claudia looked toward Robert's empty chair near the dining room window. Robert used to read newspapers there every morning while sunlight touched the silver in his hair. Now, even the chair looked abandoned. "Your father never treated me like a burden," Claudia whispered. Meredith's jaw tightened. "My father avoided conflict." The sentence hit Claudia harder than Meredith intended, because deep down Meredith partially believed it. As a little girl, Meredith had watched her grieving father remarry years after losing his first wife. She convinced herself Claudia had replaced someone irreplaceable. Over time, resentment became identity, and now grief had sharpened it into cruelty. Grant entered the kitchen moments later wearing an expensive gray suit, despite having nowhere important to go. Financial stress had hollowed him during the past year. Claudia noticed it in the way he rubbed his temples constantly and avoided eye contact whenever money came up. "Morning," he muttered. Claudia nodded politely. Grant hesitated before speaking again. "Meredith found a retirement community brochure you should look at." There it was again, that wordless effort to remove her, to relocate her quietly before she became inconvenient. Claudia set her coffee cup down carefully. "I'm not leaving my home." Meredith laughed once under her breath. "You can't maintain this place alone." "I managed before I married Robert. That was 40 years ago." The room fell silent. Claudia felt humiliation burning beneath her skin, but something else had begun growing beside it. Suspicion. Because none of this felt like grief. It felt rushed. Desperate. Like people trying to finish something before time ran out. That afternoon, while Meredith attended another meeting with Derek Hanley, Claudia made a decision she never imagined making. She went to see Robert's longtime attorney, or rather the man she thought had been Robert's attorney. The office sat near the inner harbor inside an old brick building Robert had visited for years. Claudia remembered accompanying him there once after signing tax papers decades earlier. But when she entered the reception area, confusion met her instantly. A young receptionist smiled politely. "May I help you? I'm here to speak with Mr. Bennett." The woman frowned apologetically. "Arthur Bennett retired nearly 4 years ago." Claudia froze. "Retired? That's impossible," she whispered. "No, ma'am. His son sold the practice after his stroke." Cold spread slowly through Claudia's chest. "What about Derek Hanley?" The receptionist blinked. "He rents office space upstairs occasionally. He's independent." Independent. Not Robert's attorney, not the man Robert trusted. Claudia thanked her quietly and stepped back outside into the gray Baltimore afternoon. Rain soaked the sidewalks while traffic screamed past. For several moments she simply stood there beneath the awning, unable to breathe properly. Robert had never mentioned Arthur Bennett retiring, which meant one horrifying possibility became unavoidable. Meredith introduced Derek Hanley after Robert became ill, not before. And if Derek was not Robert's real attorney, then who exactly had prepared the papers Meredith kept demanding Claudia sign? By the time Claudia returned to the condo, her hands were trembling again. Meredith immediately noticed. "Where were you?" The question came too fast, too sharp. Claudia hesitated carefully. "Walking." Meredith stared at her for several long seconds, then her eyes narrowed slightly. "You shouldn't wander around alone right now." The words sounded less like concern and more like control. That night, Claudia packed quietly after midnight. Not because she knew exactly what Robert had hidden, but because she finally understood one thing clearly. Staying in Baltimore was no longer safe. She placed only necessities into a small overnight bag. A sweater, medication, toothbrush, the photograph, the brass key, Robert's note. Nothing else mattered. Before leaving the bedroom, Claudia paused beside the framed wedding portrait hanging near the dresser. 38 years earlier, Robert stood beside her smiling beneath autumn leaves in Vermont, his hand wrapped gently around hers. "You make this place feel alive." Tears filled her eyes again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered into the darkness. But deep down, Claudia already knew the answer. Because Robert had been trying to protect her. At dawn, while Meredith and Grant still slept, Claudia quietly left the condo for the final time. The elevator ride down felt strangely peaceful. No arguments, no humiliation, only silence. By 7:30 that morning, Claudia sat alone inside a nearly empty bus terminal with her overnight bag resting beside her feet. Around her, strangers hurried toward destinations and ordinary lives. But Claudia felt suspended between worlds. Behind her stood the city where she lost everything. Ahead waited Ashford Hollow, a place connected somehow to Robert's fear, a place hidden beneath decades of silence. As the old bus pulled away from Baltimore, Claudia stared out the window while the skyline slowly disappeared behind gray rain clouds. And for the first time since Robert's death, she felt something stronger than grief. She felt the terrifying beginning of truth. The bus arrived in Ashford Hollow just after sunset. By then the rain had stopped leaving the small rural town wrapped in cold mist and fading orange light. Claudia Alexander stepped carefully onto the cracked pavement, clutching her overnight bag, while the bus station behind her emptied within minutes. The silence startled her first. Baltimore had always breathed with noise, sirens, traffic voices rising through apartment walls. But Ashford Hollow felt abandoned by time itself. A single diner glowed weakly across the road. An old pickup truck rolled past slowly. Then, nothing. Claudia pulled Robert's photograph from her purse again beneath the flickering station light. The faded image showed a white farmhouse surrounded by barren winter trees and leaning wooden fences. On the back, Robert had written only 3 words decades earlier: Ashford Hollow Farm. No address, no explanation, just silence. The station attendant, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes, noticed the photograph while locking the ticket counter. "You looking for the Alexander place?" Claudia looked up quickly. "You know it?" The woman gave a short laugh. "Everybody around here knows it. Or used to." Something uneasy passed through her expression afterward. "It's about 6 miles west of town," she added. "Road's rough this time of year." Claudia hesitated. "Is there a taxi service?" The woman shook her head. "Not anymore." For a moment Claudia considered finding a motel and waiting until morning. But Robert's note burned inside her purse like urgency itself. "If they erase you after I'm gone." She could still hear Meredith's voice in the condo. "She has no legal claim to anything." Claudia swallowed hard. "No," she whispered to herself. "I'm going tonight." An elderly mechanic named Walter Green eventually agreed to drive her after overhearing the conversation at the diner. His rusted Ford truck smelled faintly of gasoline and tobacco as they traveled through winding country roads beneath darkening skies. "You family of Robert Alexander?" Walter asked. Claudia nodded carefully. "I was his wife." Walter glanced toward her with visible surprise. "Didn't know he got married again." "Again?" The word lingered painfully. "He rarely came back here?" Claudia asked softly. Walter shook his head slowly. "Not after his father died. Town always said the old place carried bad memories." "What kind of memories?" Walter tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "The kind folks stopped talking about." Then he refused to say more. The deeper they drove into the countryside, the narrower the roads became. Dense woods crowded both sides, while fog drifted low across frozen fields. Finally, Walter slowed near a rusted mailbox barely visible beneath overgrown weeds. Alexander Farm. The faded lettering nearly disappeared beneath years of weather damage. Walter pointed ahead. "There she is." Claudia's breath caught instantly. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by dead grass and skeletal trees. Moonlight revealed peeling white paint, sagging porch railings, and dark empty windows staring across the property like hollow eyes. It looked forgotten. Buried. Exactly like Robert's note. Walter helped unload Claudia's bag beside the gate. "You sure you want to stay here tonight?" Claudia stared at the farmhouse. No electricity glowed inside. No signs of life. Only silence and wind moving through dead branches. "No," she admitted quietly. "But I think I have to." Walter studied her face for several seconds, then his expression softened. "Robert wasn't a bad man," he said carefully. "Whatever happened here, it haunted him." Before Claudia could ask more, Walter climbed back into the truck and drove away. Soon the sound of the engine disappeared completely, leaving Claudia alone. Completely alone. For several moments she stood frozen near the gate while cold wind tugged gently at her coat. Then slowly she walked toward the house. The wooden porch groaned beneath her weight as she climbed the steps. Her trembling fingers tested the front doorknob. Locked? Claudia reached into her purse and removed the brass key Robert left behind. Her heart pounded violently as she inserted it into the old lock. Click! The door opened immediately. A sharp smell of cedarwood dust and cold air drifted out into the darkness. Claudia stepped inside cautiously. The farmhouse was not abandoned. Not truly. Dust covered many surfaces, but the rooms had clearly been maintained. Blankets folded neatly on chairs. Firewood stacked carefully beside the stone fireplace. Fresh candles stored near the kitchen counter. Someone had prepared this place. Robert. Tears filled Claudia's eyes instantly. For years, she believed her husband had grown distant because illness changed him. But now she realized something else entirely. Robert had been planning, preparing, protecting. Claudia wandered slowly through the house while carrying a small oil lantern she found near the doorway. Every room revealed signs of quiet maintenance. The kitchen shelves contained canned food dated only months earlier. The upstairs bedroom held freshly washed linens. Even the windows had been repaired recently. Robert had been here, perhaps many times, without ever telling her. The realization hurt more than Claudia expected, not because she felt betrayed, because she understood how frightened he must have been to hide something this carefully. A sudden gust of wind rattled the old walls. Claudia flinched instinctively. Then, she noticed something strange beneath the staircase near the hallway. A narrow wooden door. Locked. Her pulse quickened immediately. The brass key still rested in her hand. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the small door beneath the stairs. For one brief second, fear nearly stopped her. At 76 years old, Claudia had spent most of her life avoiding conflict, avoiding danger, avoiding unpleasant truths. Robert always protected her from hard things. But Robert was gone now, and somehow his final act had led her here. Claudia inserted the key. Another click echoed softly through the silent farmhouse. The door creaked open. Inside was a small hidden room. Claudia lifted the lantern higher. Shelves lined the walls. Cardboard storage boxes sat stacked carefully in one corner, each labeled in Robert's handwriting. Taxes, property records, medical files, investigations. Investigations. Claudia's stomach tightened. At the center of the room stood an old filing cabinet beside a wooden table. On top rested a cassette tape recorder covered with a thin layer of dust. Beside it sat one single cassette, labeled, "For Claudia, play first." Her breathing became shallow. Every instinct told her to walk away, because whatever Robert buried here had already destroyed peace inside their family long before his death. But another part of Claudia, the part humiliated by Meredith, frightened by Derek Hanley, and abandoned in her own home, needed answers now. Needed truth. Slowly, she sat down at the table. The chair creaked beneath her. Her trembling fingers picked up the cassette tape. Then she noticed one final detail. A folded wool blanket lay draped carefully across another chair beside the recorder. The exact navy blanket Claudia once bought Robert during a winter trip to Vermont. He had left it here intentionally, as if he knew she would eventually sit in this room, as if he had imagined this exact moment long before he died. Claudia finally broke. Tears spilled down her face while she pressed the blanket tightly against her chest. "You knew," she whispered into the empty room. "You knew they would come after me." Outside, wind swept through the dead fields surrounding Ashford Hollow Farm. But inside the hidden room beneath the staircase, Claudia Alexander realized something that changed everything. Her husband had not sent her here to hide. He sent her here to uncover the truth. The cassette tape trembled in Claudia Alexander's hands. For several long moments, she simply stared at it, while the lantern light flickered softly across the hidden room beneath the staircase. For Claudia. Play first, Robert's handwriting looked rushed, uneven, fearful. Outside, wind scraped frozen branches against the farmhouse walls, but inside the room everything felt painfully still. Claudia swallowed hard and reached toward the old cassette recorder. The machine clicked loudly when she pressed play. Static crackled first. Then came Robert's voice. Weak, tired, but unmistakably Robert. "Claudia." The sound of his voice shattered something inside her immediately. Tears filled her eyes before he even continued. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. And Meredith has already started doing exactly what I feared she would." Claudia covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Robert paused on the tape, coughing softly somewhere in the background. "I'm sorry," he continued quietly. "God, I'm so sorry. I waited this long to tell you everything." The room suddenly felt smaller. He knew. He truly knew. For years. "You always believed my silence came from shame," Robert said, "but it came from fear." Static hissed softly between sentences. "I thought I could protect everyone if I kept certain things buried. I was wrong." Claudia closed her eyes tightly. In Baltimore, during Robert's final months, she often caught him staring toward windows or drifting into silence during conversations. She thought illness was stealing him piece by piece. Now she realized he had been carrying terror alone. "Meredith changed after her mother died," Robert continued on the tape. "I spent years excusing it because grief does terrible things to people. But grief became entitlement. Then, entitlement became greed." Claudia lowered her head slowly. Part of her still resisted hearing it aloud. Not because she doubted Robert, because hearing the truth made the family collapse feel permanent. "Grant Caldwell's financial situation worsened 2 years ago," Robert explained. "Bad investments. Debt hidden behind appearances." Meredith became desperate after that. A long silence followed before Robert spoke again, quieter this time. "She began pressuring me constantly about inheritance properties account transfers. At first it was subtle. Then it became manipulation." Claudia's stomach twisted painfully. She remembered those months now. Meredith insisting Robert simplify paperwork. Meredith intercepting phone calls. Meredith suddenly managing appointments Claudia used to handle herself. "I should have stopped it sooner," Robert admitted. "But I kept believing she would come back to herself." The recorder crackled softly again. She never did. Claudia wiped tears from her cheeks while staring at the filing cabinet across the room. Everything around her suddenly carried unbearable weight. The boxes, the records, the hidden room itself. Robert had built this sanctuary while slowly realizing his own daughter intended to erase his wife after his death. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Ashford Hollow does not belong to Meredith." Claudia froze. "It never did," Robert continued firmly. "And if the documents remain where I hid them, then legally, part of this property belongs to you." Her breath caught. But the word escaped her lips aloud despite being alone. On the tape, Robert exhaled shakily before continuing. "Years ago, after my father Charles died, I discovered records he kept hidden from everyone, including me." Claudia's pulse quickened. "Your mother, Evelyn Brooks, saved this farm in 1968. The room tilted around her. "No, that was impossible." Claudia leaned forward instinctively, listening harder. "When drought nearly destroyed the property, Robert explained my father secretly borrowed money from Evelyn. Not a small amount, enough to save everything." Claudia shook her head slowly in disbelief. Her mother died when Claudia was 23. She remembered Evelyn Brooks as hard-working, exhausted, and permanently worried about bills. She cleaned houses, worked laundry shifts, and spent most evenings sewing clothes for extra income. She never spoke about wealth, never spoke about helping wealthy landowners. "She refused repayment," Robert said. "But my father insisted on placing a protected portion of the land into trust for Evelyn's descendants." Claudia stared into darkness. Her entire childhood suddenly felt unfamiliar. "I didn't discover the truth until 15 years into our marriage," Robert admitted. "My father hid the records because he feared public embarrassment. A proud man accepting help from a widowed seamstress would have destroyed his reputation back then." Tears rolled silently down Claudia's face. Not from money, not from inheritance, from realizing her mother had lived and died carrying sacrifices no one honored. "She never told me," Claudia whispered brokenly. On the tape, Robert's voice softened. "I know." For a moment, the silence between recorded words felt almost alive. "I wanted to tell you many times," Robert continued. "But by then, Meredith already believed Ashford Hollow belonged solely to the Alexander family legacy. If she learned the truth—" He paused heavily. I was afraid of what she might do. Claudia suddenly remembered one specific argument from years earlier. Meredith storming out during Thanksgiving dinner after Robert mentioned donating unused farmland someday. This family built everything itself. Meredith snapped angrily at the time. People always want pieces of what belongs to us. Robert never responded. Now Claudia understood why. The tape recorder hissed softly again. The documents are inside the filing cabinet, Robert said carefully. Trust papers, deeds, letters from my father, proof of everything. Claudia's eyes shifted toward the cabinet again. But listen carefully to me. Robert added, his voice suddenly urgent. Do not contact Meredith yet. Fear crept coldly down Claudia's spine. If Derek Hanley is still involved, then they're moving faster than I expected. Faster than I expected. Robert knew about Derek, too. Arthur Bennett helped me prepare protections before he retired. Robert continued weakly. But after my diagnosis worsened, Meredith began controlling access to my meetings. I couldn't stop all of it. Claudia pressed trembling fingers against her lips. So she had been right. Robert's isolation during illness was deliberate, controlled, manipulated. I failed you in many ways, Robert whispered. I thought I had more time. Then his voice cracked for the first time. But, Claudia, you must understand this one thing. The tape briefly distorted before stabilizing again. You were never the outsider in this family. Claudia broke completely then. A sob escaped her chest as decades of quiet humiliation collapsed at once. All those years trying to earn Meredith's approval, trying not to take space, trying to be tolerated. And all along Robert knew the truth buried beneath Ashford Hollow connected Claudia herself to the property more deeply than anyone realized. This farm survived because of your mother, Robert said softly. Not mine. Silence followed for several seconds. Then came Robert's final words on the tape. The rest of the truth is in the cabinet, and if Meredith finds you before you're ready, do not trust her tears. Click. The cassette ended. The room fell silent, except for Claudia's uneven breathing. Outside snow had begun falling softly across Ashford Hollow. Claudia sat motionless for a very long time. Not because she felt victorious, because her entire life had shifted beneath her feet. Her mother had carried a secret sacrifice. Her husband spent years protecting hidden truths. And Meredith may have spent years trying to steal something that never legally belonged to her at all. Slowly, Claudia rose from the chair. Her knees trembled from age exhaustion and emotional shock, but something inside her had changed now. The frightened widow who boarded the bus in Baltimore was beginning to disappear. In her place stood a woman slowly uncovering the truth of her own life. Claudia walked carefully toward the old filing cabinet. Then she reached for the handle. The filing cabinet was locked. For one terrible moment, Claudia Alexander thought she would need another hidden key, another puzzle left behind by Robert's fear. But when she pulled gently on the top drawer, it slid open with a rusty groan. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Every tab carried Robert's handwriting. Trust documents, property records, bank transfers, medical authorizations, private notes. Claudia stared at them while cold lantern light flickered across the metal cabinet. This was not random storage. This was evidence. Robert had built a case. Slowly, Claudia removed the top folder and carried it back to the small wooden table beneath the staircase. Her hands trembled less now. Fear still existed, but another feeling had begun pushing against it. Clarity. For the first time since Robert's death, Claudia no longer felt completely helpless. She opened the folder carefully. Inside rested copies of legal documents dating back nearly 60 years. Some pages were yellowed with age, while others looked recent. One name appeared repeatedly. Evelyn Brooks, her mother. Claudia swallowed hard. The documents described emergency agricultural loans issued privately in 1968 during a devastating drought that nearly bankrupted Ashford Hollow Farm. Charles Alexander Roberts' father had signed every page. So had Evelyn Brooks. Claudia stared in disbelief. The signature was unmistakable. Elegant, cursive handwriting she remembered from childhood birthday cards and handwritten grocery lists. Her mother truly had saved this place. A sudden memory surfaced unexpectedly. Claudia was 10 years old again, sitting beside Evelyn in a cramped Baltimore apartment while her mother counted money late at night beside the kitchen sink. "Why don't we buy nicer things?" young Claudia once asked innocently. Evelyn smiled tiredly and kissed her forehead. "Because sometimes helping people matters more." At the time, Claudia assumed her mother meant church donations or helping neighbors. Now she realized the truth had been far larger and far more expensive. Claudia carefully continued reading. One document stopped her breathing entirely. In consideration of financial preservation efforts rendered by Evelyn Brooks, 15% of Ashford Hollow agricultural holdings shall remain protected under trust designation for surviving descendants of Evelyn Brooks. Claudia read the sentence 3 times. 15%. Protected. For descendants. For her. Tears blurred the words instantly. All her life, Claudia believed she came from nothing. Her mother worked herself sick, cleaning homes for wealthy families while hiding unpaid bills beneath kitchen drawers. And yet somehow, quietly, secretly, Evelyn Brooks helped preserve an entire farm without asking for recognition, without ever telling her daughter. A sharp knock suddenly echoed somewhere upstairs. Claudia jumped violently. The folder slipped from her hands. Silence followed. Then another sound. Wind. Only wind against the farmhouse shutters. Claudia exhaled shakily and pressed trembling fingers against her chest. Her nerves were unraveling. The farmhouse carried too much silence, too many shadows, too many secrets buried beneath old wood and dead fields. But still she continued searching. Hours passed. The deeper Claudia looked into the files, the more disturbing the truth became. Robert had documented everything carefully. Suspicious withdrawals, asset transfers, copies of Meredith's requests for financial power over Robert during his illness, and handwritten notes describing arguments Robert never spoke about aloud. June 14th, Meredith demanded early transfer of Baltimore condo ownership. August 2nd, Grant requested access to investment accounts temporarily. September 18th, Derek Hanley advised simplifying estate structure immediately. The pattern became horrifyingly clear. They had been preparing long before Robert died. Claudia closed her eyes briefly. Part of her still wanted another explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. But truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Near the bottom drawer, Claudia discovered a smaller envelope sealed with dark blue wax, written across the front, "For Claudia only." Her hands immediately began shaking again. Carefully she opened it. Inside were several folded letters tied together with pale ribbon. The top letter carried her mother's handwriting. Claudia nearly stopped breathing. "My sweet girl," the letter began. Claudia's vision blurred instantly. She sat down slowly before continuing. "If you are reading this, then Robert finally told you about Ashford Hollow. I prayed he would one day." Tears spilled down Claudia's cheeks before she finished the second sentence. "Your mother spent her whole life protecting you from the bitterness of poor people carrying pride. Charles Alexander wanted to repay me publicly, but I refused because this town would have destroyed both our names back then." Claudia pressed the letter against her chest. She could almost hear Evelyn's tired voice again. Steady, gentle, strong. "I did not help that family because I expected reward. I helped them because your father died and I knew what losing everything felt like." Claudia's breathing became uneven. Her father died in a factory accident when she was only 6 years old. Evelyn never remarried, never complained, never allowed herself softness. And somehow, through all that struggle, she secretly saved Ashford Hollow Farm. The letter continued. Charles insisted on protecting part of the land for you. I accepted only because he promised your future would never depend on another person's mercy. Claudia covered her mouth and cried openly then, because mercy was exactly what she had been surviving on for years. Meredith's tolerance, Robert's protection, other people deciding whether she deserved space in their lives. But Evelyn had tried to protect her daughter long before death ever separated them. A floorboard creaked upstairs suddenly. This time it was not the wind. Claudia froze instantly. Every muscle tightened. The farmhouse fell silent again. Slowly, carefully, she rose from the chair and lifted the lantern higher. Another creak echoed above her. Footsteps. Her pulse exploded into panic. Someone was inside the house. Claudia quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging the hidden room into darkness. Her breathing became painfully shallow as she listened. The footsteps moved slowly across the upstairs hallway, then stopped. Silence. Cold fear spread through her chest. Meredith Grant. Had they followed her? Claudia clutched Evelyn's letter tightly while crouching motionless beside the table. The darkness felt suffocating. Then scratch. A soft, scraping sound above the hidden room. Claudia nearly cried out. Suddenly a loud thud crashed across the upstairs floor. Then rapid movement. Then silence again. Several endless seconds passed. Finally came a low animal growl. Claudia blinked in confusion. A raccoon burst suddenly through a damaged upstairs window frame, knocking loose debris across the old floorboards before scrambling back outside. Claudia collapsed weakly against the chair in relief. "Oh, God!" She laughed shakily through tears. The fear inside her body felt unbearable now, not only because of the farmhouse, because she understood something terrifying. If Meredith discovered these documents before Claudia secured them legally, everything Robert protected could disappear forever. Claudia relit the lantern slowly. Then she noticed something else hidden inside the bottom cabinet drawer. A small metal lockbox. Old. Heavy. Its edges covered with rust. Unlike the filing cabinet, this box had no keyhole visible from the front. Instead, a handwritten note rested on top, beneath the pantry floor. Claudia frowned. She lifted the note. Underneath, Robert had drawn a rough sketch of the farmhouse kitchen. An X marked a specific section near the pantry shelves. Her pulse quickened again. Another hiding place. Another secret. Robert truly had prepared layers upon layers of protection, as if he knew one discovery alone might not save her. Claudia carefully gathered Evelyn's letters, the trust documents, and Robert's notes into a canvas bag she found inside the room. Then she stood slowly beneath the dim lantern glow. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Ashford Hollow. The farmhouse no longer felt abandoned now. It felt watchful, like generations of buried truths were finally beginning to rise. And somewhere deep beneath the kitchen floor, another secret was still waiting for her. Here's her. 3 days after Claudia disappeared from Baltimore, Meredith Caldwell stopped pretending she was calm. She wouldn't just vanish, she snapped, pacing across the luxury hotel suite Grant had rented temporarily to avoid creditors calling the condo again. She's 76 years old. Grant sat near the window scrolling anxiously through banking notifications on his phone. She probably went to stay with friends. She doesn't have friends. The cruelty in Meredith's answer came naturally now. Too naturally. Grant looked up briefly. You don't know that. Meredith ignored him. The truth was more complicated than anger. Deep beneath the bitterness she carried toward Claudia lived something uglier. Fear. Because Meredith knew her father better than anyone realized. And Robert Alexander had not been a careless man, especially near the end. For months before his death, Meredith noticed changes in him. Quiet phone calls, locked drawers, meetings he refused to explain. Once, she entered his study unexpectedly and caught him shoving paperwork into his desk with visible panic. When she asked what he was hiding, Robert only answered, "Things you should never touch." The memory still burned inside her. Meredith grabbed another file from the coffee table and flipped through it aggressively. Derek should have finalized everything before the funeral. Grant rubbed his forehead tiredly. He said Robert delayed signatures repeatedly, because Claudia kept interfering. Grant almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. Claudia interfering. The woman barely raised her voice in 40 years, but Grant stayed silent because silence had become survival inside his marriage. Outside the hotel window, Baltimore traffic crawled through gray afternoon rain, while collection notices filled Grant's email inbox one after another. 3 failed commercial developments, 1 lawsuit, millions in hidden debt. And Meredith believed Robert's estate would solve everything. At first, Grant believed it too, until Claudia vanished. Now panic had entered the room. She took something Meredith whispered suddenly. Grant looked up. What? She went into Dad's study before she left. Grant's stomach tightened. You didn't say that. Because I wasn't sure. But Meredith had been sure. The hidden drawer. She remembered it now. When Robert was still strong enough to work in the study regularly, Meredith once saw him adjusting something beneath the desk. He immediately shut the drawer afterward and changed the subject. At the time, she assumed it was old financial records. Now, she wasn't so certain. What if he left her documents? Grant asked quietly. Meredith stopped pacing instantly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, because both were thinking the same thing. Ashford Hollow. Grant stood slowly. You don't think... Yes. Meredith grabbed her coat immediately. He mentioned the farm twice before he died. I thought the property was abandoned. So did I. Grant stared uneasily at his wife. The problem was not merely financial anymore. If Robert hid protected assets or legal records connected to Ashford Hollow, then Meredith's control over the estate could collapse entirely. And she knew it. An hour later, Meredith sat across from Derek Hanley inside his downtown office. The attorney looked nervous before she even spoke. You told me Claudia had no access to anything important, Meredith said coldly. Derek adjusted his tie. She shouldn't have. Shouldn't Robert became difficult near the end? Secretive. Meredith leaned forward. Did he move assets? I don't know. That's not good enough. Derek lowered his voice carefully. Your father asked unusual questions before his death. Trust protections, rural deed separations, legacy transfers. Meredith's face slowly drained of color. You told me the farm wasn't legally relevant. That was before Arthur Bennett's archived files resurfaced. The room went silent. Arthur Bennett, Robert's original attorney. The name alone made Meredith uneasy. What files? She asked carefully. Derek hesitated too long. Derek. He exhaled heavily. Bennett documented old trust agreements tied to Ashford Hollow decades ago. I couldn't access the full archive because parts were sealed. Sealed for who I don't know. Fear finally touched Meredith fully then. Not grief, not guilt, fear of losing control. Because her entire plan depended on simplicity. Robert dies. Estate transfers. Claudia relocates quietly. No questions, no complications. But Robert had complicated everything from beyond the grave. Meanwhile, nearly 200 miles away, Claudia Alexander stood alone inside the Ashford Hollow farmhouse kitchen, holding a crowbar she found beside the pantry shelves. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through dusty windows while snow melted slowly across the fields outside. Her body ached from exhaustion. She barely slept after discovering Evelyn's letters and the hidden records inside the staircase room. But Robert's sketch remained folded carefully inside her sweater pocket, beneath the pantry floor. Claudia knelt carefully beside the marked section of old wood planks. The farmhouse smelled faintly of cedar dust and old winter air. For several moments, she simply stared downward. Then she wedged the crowbar beneath one loose board. The wood resisted at first, then cracked upward suddenly. A hollow space appeared underneath. Claudia's pulse quickened violently. Slowly, she removed another plank, then another. Finally, she saw it. A rectangular metal box buried beneath the floor. Smaller than a suitcase, covered in dirt and age. Claudia carefully lifted it upward with trembling hands. Unlike the rusted box from the hidden room, this one opened easily after she unlatched two side clasps. Inside rested several items wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Land deeds, more letters, a velvet pouch, and one sealed envelope labeled, "If Meredith finds this first, everything fails." Claudia stared at the sentence in horror. Robert truly believed his daughter would come searching. Hands trembling, Claudia opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Claudia, if you are reading this, then you found the second box before Meredith did. Thank God. There are people in Ashford Hollow you can still trust. One of them is Thomas Whitmore. Judge Whitmore. The name stirred faint recognition. Robert mentioned him once years ago after an old Christmas card arrived from Western Maryland. The letter continued. Thomas knows parts of the truth surrounding your mother and the original trust agreements. If anything happens to me before I can protect you legally, show him the enclosed documents immediately. Claudia quickly searched the box again. Beneath the envelope rested a sealed property map bearing county certification stamps. And underneath that, photographs. Dozens of them. Claudia froze. The images showed Meredith entering banks with Derek Hanley, Grant reviewing financial records beside Robert's wheelchair during his illness, copies of signatures, transfers, private investigator surveillance photographs. Robert had been documenting everything, not out of revenge, out of desperation. A sudden vehicle engine echoed faintly outside. Claudia's heart nearly stopped. She quickly closed the box and moved toward the kitchen window. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly past the front gate before continuing down the road. Not Meredith. Not yet. Still, fear lingered now like poison beneath her skin. Robert's warnings no longer felt paranoid. They felt justified. Later that afternoon, Claudia drove into town using the old truck Robert secretly kept in the barn. The engine rattled violently, but it worked. Ashford Hollow itself looked frozen in another era. Small storefronts, brick sidewalks, a church bell echoing softly through cold air. Everyone seemed to know each other, and everyone noticed strangers. Claudia finally stopped outside a modest white house near the courthouse square. Thomas Whitmore, retired circuit judge. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. For a moment, fear nearly convinced her to leave. But then she remembered Meredith standing inside the condo discussing her future like relocation paperwork. No legal claim to anything. Claudia stepped out of the truck slowly. She carried Robert's documents pressed tightly against her chest. And for the first time in her life, Claudia Alexander walked toward confrontation instead of away from it. Judge Thomas Whitmore answered the door himself. He was tall despite his age, with silver hair combed neatly back and sharp blue eyes that studied Claudia Alexander carefully before softening with recognition. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the old judge looked past her toward the truck parked outside. "You're Robert's wife, he said quietly. Claudia nodded. Yes. A strange sadness crossed his face immediately. I was afraid this day would come. The words sent cold unease through Claudia's chest. Judge Whitmore stepped aside without another question. Come inside, Mrs. Alexander. The house smelled faintly of old books, cedar wood, and coffee. Law journals lined nearly every wall while winter light filtered softly through lace curtains. Claudia sat carefully in the living room, clutching the canvas bag of documents against her lap. The judge lowered himself slowly into the chair opposite her. When Robert stopped answering my calls last year, he said quietly, I suspected Meredith had begun controlling access to him. Claudia stared at him. You knew. Judge Whitmore exhaled heavily. I knew enough to worry. For nearly an hour, Claudia explained everything. The funeral, the hidden drawer, the cassette tapes, the trust documents, Meredith's pressure, Derek Hanley, the hidden room beneath the staircase. Judge Whitmore listened without interrupting once. Only when Claudia finally placed Evelyn Brooks' letters onto the coffee table did the old judge close his eyes briefly. God help me, he whispered. Charles actually kept his promise. Claudia leaned forward immediately. You knew my mother. The judge nodded slowly. She was one of the strongest women I ever met. Emotion tightened Claudia's throat instantly. Very few people spoke about Evelyn anymore. Most who remembered her were gone. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses carefully. In 1968, Ashford Hollow was dying, he explained. Drought destroyed crops for nearly 2 years. Charles Alexander hid the crisis because pride mattered more to him than honesty. He glanced toward Evelyn's letters. Your mother saved that farm quietly, paid workers herself, bought feed, prevented foreclosure. Claudia shook her head in disbelief again. She never told me any of this, because that generation believed sacrifice should stay invisible. The judge's voice softened, but Charles carried guilt afterward. So he created the protected trust. Claudia lowered her eyes. My whole life. I thought my mother barely survived. She barely did. Judge Whitmore answered gently. Helping the Alexanders nearly ruined her financially. Pain crossed Claudia's face instantly. The judge noticed. She chose it willingly, he added carefully. Your mother believed dignity came from helping others, not from recognition. Tears filled Claudia's eyes again. Robert had married a woman shaped by quiet sacrifice, and somehow he spent decades trying to protect her the same way Evelyn once did. Judge Whitmore slowly reviewed the documents from the second lockbox. The deeper he read, the grimmer his expression became. These surveillance photographs, he murmured. Robert hired a private investigator. Yes. The judge nodded heavily. He must have realized Meredith intended to challenge the trust structure before his death. Claudia hesitated before asking the question that haunted her most. Did Robert know his daughter was capable of this? Judge Whitmore remained silent for several moments. Then, finally, yes. The answer devastated Claudia more than she expected. Not because it shocked her, because it confirmed how lonely Robert's final years truly were. He loved Meredith deeply, the judge continued carefully. But love doesn't blind you forever. Claudia stared at the photographs spread across the coffee table. Images of bank meetings, signed transfers, Derek Hanley carrying financial files. Everything looked cold, calculated. This isn't only about inheritance anymore, Judge Whitmore said gravely. If these signatures are fraudulent, there could be criminal exposure. Criminal. The word echoed heavily through the room. Claudia never imagined police courts or fraud would become part of her life at 76 years old. She used to worry about grocery lists and church bake sales. Now she carried evidence hidden beneath farmhouse floors. The judge carefully organized the papers into neat stacks. "You cannot stay unprotected," he said firmly. "If Meredith discovers what you have, she'll come here." Claudia looked toward the window instinctively. Fear returned immediately. "What should I do?" Judge Whitmore studied her carefully before answering. "First, stop behaving like a frightened guest in your own life." The sentence stunned her. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Robert prepared all this because he believed you were stronger than you realize." Claudia looked down quietly. All her life, strength belonged to other people. Robert? Meredith? Confident women with loud voices and certainty, not her. The judge seemed to read her thoughts. "Your mother crossed this town alone in 1968, carrying enough money to save a dying farm, while men twice her size mocked her for trying," he said, softly. "You come from stronger blood than you think." Claudia felt something shift painfully inside her chest. Not confidence. Not yet, but possibility. As afternoon light faded toward evening, Judge Whitmore escorted Claudia back to Ashford Hollow Farm himself. Snow covered the fields now in soft white silence while dusk settled across the property. The judge stood near the porch, studying the farmhouse with visible memory in his eyes. "Robert rebuilt the greenhouse himself after college," he said quietly. Claudia blinked. The greenhouse Judge Whitmore pointed behind the house. Beyond the dead winter field stood a long structure partially hidden beneath vines and weathered plastic panels. Claudia had barely noticed it before. "Robert spent half his childhood hiding there," the judge continued. "Said it was the only place his father stopped shouting." A painful sadness crossed his face. Charles Alexander was not an easy man. The judge suddenly paused. Then his expression changed. "What is it?" Claudia asked. Instead of answering, he walked slowly toward the greenhouse. Claudia followed carefully through snow and dead grass until they reached the old structure. The wooden door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. Judge Whitmore frowned. "This was locked when I visited Robert last spring." Claudia's pulse quickened instantly. Someone had forced the door open recently. Inside the greenhouse smelled of wet soil, broken glass, and freezing air. Moonlight filtered weakly through cracked ceiling panels. Shelves stood overturned. Old gardening tools scattered across the floor. Someone had searched this place. Claudia's breathing became shallow. "Meredith," she whispered. "Possibly." Judge Whitmore moved carefully deeper inside. Then he stopped beside an old planting table near the far wall. "Claudia." She hurried toward him. Beneath the broken table, partially hidden under loose boards, rested a leather-bound ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Fresh mud covered its edges. Someone had almost found it, or perhaps failed to notice it completely. Judge Whitmore handed it carefully to Claudia. "Open it." Her fingers trembled as she untied the straps. Inside were pages and pages of handwritten notes, dates, bank account numbers, transfer records, copies of signatures, and photographs. Robert's photographs. One page immediately caught Claudia's eye. Private investigation. Meredith Caldwell. The room suddenly felt freezing. Another page revealed notarized copies of suspicious transfers from Robert's personal accounts during periods when he was hospitalized. Then Claudia saw something worse. A handwritten note from Robert himself. "If anything happens to me unexpectedly, investigate Meredith's financial pressure immediately." Claudia covered her mouth in horror. The next page contained printed emails between Derek Hanley and Grant Caldwell discussing accelerating liquidation before external review. Judge Whitmore's face darkened. "This is serious." Then Claudia discovered the final envelope tucked into the ledger. Inside rested one last note written by Robert in shaky handwriting. "Do not fight for revenge. Fight so they cannot do this to anyone else." Claudia stared at the words for a very long time. Outside, winter wind swept across Ashford Hollow Farm, while darkness swallowed the fields around them. But inside the ruined greenhouse, surrounded by buried secrets and shattered lies, Claudia Alexander finally understood something clearly. Robert never wanted her to hide from the truth. He wanted her to survive it. And for the first time since his death, Claudia no longer wanted only safety. She wanted justice. Meredith Caldwell arrived at Ashford Hollow Farm just before noon 3 days later. Claudia saw the black SUV from the farmhouse kitchen window while washing dirt from old coffee cups beside the sink. Her stomach tightened instantly. "She's here?" she whispered. Judge Thomas Whitmore, seated at the kitchen table reviewing copies of the trust documents, looked calmly toward the driveway. So, it begins. Snow crunched beneath tires as the SUV stopped near the porch. Grant stepped out first, adjusting his expensive coat against the bitter wind. Meredith emerged seconds later wearing dark sunglasses despite the gray winter sky. Even from a distance, Claudia could see tension carved sharply across her face, fear disguised as anger. Judge Whitmore rose slowly. "Remember what Robert told you." Claudia nodded weakly. "Do not fight for revenge. Fight so they cannot do this to anyone else." Still, her hands trembled. Not because Meredith frightened her the way she once had, because confronting betrayal directly felt unbearable after a lifetime spent avoiding conflict. A hard knock echoed through the farmhouse. Then another. Claudia Meredith's voice cut sharply through the silence. "Open the door." Grant shifted uneasily behind her. He already regretted coming. The deeper the situation became, the clearer it felt that Robert Alexander had anticipated everything. Claudia inhaled slowly and walked toward the entrance. When she opened the door, cold wind rushed inside immediately. Meredith removed her sunglasses. For a brief second, something almost human crossed her expression. Relief. Because Claudia was alive. Then the relief disappeared beneath fury. "You disappeared," Meredith snapped. "I left. You vanished without telling anyone." Claudia looked at her calmly. "I don't owe you permission to leave my own home." The sentence stunned Meredith visibly. Claudia herself felt surprised hearing it aloud. Judge Whitmore stepped into view behind her. Meredith's face immediately hardened. "Judge Whitmore," she said coldly. "Meredith." Grant's anxiety deepened instantly. This was worse than he expected. Much worse. "What exactly is happening here?" Meredith demanded. Judge Whitmore answered evenly. "Mrs. Alexander is reviewing protected property records connected to Ashford Hollow." Meredith laughed sharply. "Protected by who? Your grandfather, among others." Silence crashed heavily across the porch. Grant slowly turned toward Meredith. "You told me the farm was abandoned." "It was." Judge Whitmore's expression remained calm. "No, it was hidden." Meredith stepped forward aggressively. "This property belongs to my family." Claudia finally spoke. "It also belongs to mine." The words landed like thunder. Meredith stared at her in disbelief. Then anger exploded fully. "She's lying." "No," Judge Whitmore replied quietly. "She's documented." Meredith's breathing quickened. For years, she controlled conversations simply by sounding more confident than everyone around her. Most people retreated under pressure. But Claudia no longer looked frightened, and that terrified Meredith more than the documents themselves. "Whatever she showed you is incomplete," Meredith said quickly. "My father was confused near the end." The moment the sentence left her mouth, Claudia felt something inside her finally break free. Not grief, not fear. Submission. "No," Claudia answered softly. "Your father was terrified." Meredith froze. Judge Whitmore watched silently while decades of buried pain surfaced between both women. "You isolated him," Claudia continued. You controlled meetings, paperwork, financial transfers. That's ridiculous. You replaced his attorney." Meredith's eyes flashed instantly. "There's nothing illegal about hiring legal counsel." "Arthur Bennett retired 4 years ago," Claudia replied calmly. You never told Robert. Grant slowly looked toward his wife. You said Bennett transferred the case willingly. He did. But now Meredith sounded uncertain. Claudia noticed it immediately. For the first time in nearly 40 years, Meredith Caldwell was losing control of the narrative. Judge Whitmore stepped carefully between them. This conversation should proceed through formal review. Meredith ignored him completely. What exactly did she find, she demanded. No one answered. That silence confirmed everything. Meredith suddenly pushed past Claudia into the farmhouse. Meredith Grant warned. But she was already moving room to room rapidly, searching, exactly as Robert predicted. Claudia followed slowly behind while Judge Whitmore remained near the doorway, watching carefully. Meredith entered the living room first, then the staircase room, then, finally, the kitchen. Panic sharpened her movements more with every passing second. Where are the files? She snapped. Claudia crossed her arms quietly. You already know they exist. The sentence stopped Meredith cold. A dangerous silence followed. Because Claudia had just revealed something crucial. Meredith never asked whether documents existed, only where they were hidden. Grant realized it too. He stared at his wife with growing alarm. Meredith? She ignored him. You don't understand what you're doing, she hissed toward Claudia. No, Claudia answered softly. I finally do. Outside, another vehicle approached the farmhouse, a county sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Ellen Parker stepped out moments later, wearing a thick winter coat and carrying an official folder beneath one arm. Meredith's face lost color immediately. Why is she here? Judge Whitmore answered calmly. Because I requested documentation support before your arrival. The sheriff entered the farmhouse slowly. Afternoon. Meredith attempted a composed smile. This is a family misunderstanding. Sheriff Parker looked toward Claudia first. Mrs. Alexander Claudia straightened slightly. Yes. Do you feel threatened at this time? The question stunned Meredith. What? Of course not. But the sheriff continued watching Claudia carefully. For years, Claudia would have minimized everything automatically. Avoid conflict. Avoid trouble. Avoid becoming inconvenient. But Robert's final words echoed again inside her mind. Fight so they cannot do this to anyone else. Claudia lifted her chin slowly. Yes, she answered. The room went silent. Meredith stared at her like a stranger. Sheriff Parker nodded once. Understood. Grant stepped backward uneasily. This is getting out of hand. No, Judge Whitmore said quietly. This is finally becoming documented. Meredith's composure cracked completely then. You think she deserves this? She snapped toward the judge. She married my father after my mother died and spent decades pretending she belonged here. Claudia flinched slightly. Even now, after everything, the cruelty still hurt. Judge Whitmore's expression darkened. Your grandfather disagreed. Meredith laughed bitterly. My grandfather barely knew her. He knew Evelyn Brooks. The room froze. Meredith slowly turned toward Claudia. What did you say? Judge Whitmore answered carefully. The Ashford Hollow Trust includes protected holdings tied to Evelyn Brooks' descendants. Meredith's face drained completely white. Grant stared at her in horror. You knew about this, no. But she answered too quickly. Claudia suddenly remembered something from years earlier. Thanksgiving dinner. Meredith angrily declaring, this family built everything itself. Not built, protected. Meredith had known pieces of the truth far longer than she admitted. Sheriff Parker noticed the silence immediately. Ms. Caldwell, she said evenly, have you previously reviewed hidden trust records related to this property? Meredith hesitated. 1 second too long. Grant closed his eyes briefly, and Claudia saw it happen. The exact moment Meredith realized the lies were collapsing faster than she could contain them. "She found documents before anyone else," Meredith blurted suddenly. "Dad hid them from me." The admission echoed loudly through the farmhouse. Judge Whitmore stared at her. "You just confirmed prior knowledge of concealed records." Meredith's eyes widened instantly. Too late. The damage was done. Grant whispered under his breath, "Oh my God." Claudia stood motionless near the kitchen table while cold wind rattled the farmhouse windows around them. For nearly 40 years, she believed surviving meant staying quiet, smaller, easier to dismiss. But now Meredith looked frightened of her. Not because Claudia shouted louder, because truth finally stood beside her. Sheriff Parker carefully opened her folder. Given the disputes surrounding estate control and protected property claims, she said firmly, "I strongly advise all parties to avoid removing documents or assets until formal review occurs." Meredith looked toward Claudia one final time, hatred mixed now with desperation. "This isn't over." Claudia met her eyes steadily. "No," she answered softly. "It's finally beginning." And for the first time since Robert's death, Meredith Caldwell understood something terrifying. The widow she tried to erase was no longer afraid of her. The county hearing took place on a freezing Monday morning beneath gray skies and steady wind. Ashford Hollow's courthouse stood at the center of town like something preserved from another century. Red brick walls, narrow windows, and worn marble steps polished by generations of footsteps. Claudia Alexander paused outside the entrance for several seconds before going inside. Her hands trembled slightly despite the gloves. Not from cold, from memory. For most of her life, buildings like this terrified her. Courts belonged to powerful people, confident people, people with expensive attorneys and sharp voices, people like Meredith Caldwell, not widows who spent decades trying not to inconvenience anyone. Judge Thomas Whitmore noticed Claudia hesitating beside the courthouse doors. "You can still breathe," he said gently. Claudia looked toward him. "What if they destroy me in there?" The old judge's expression softened. "They already tried." The truth of that sentence settled heavily inside her chest, and somehow instead of weakening her, it steadied her. Inside the courtroom, Meredith sat beside Derek Hanley wearing a cream-colored suit that projected wealth and control. But Claudia immediately noticed the cracks beneath the performance. Meredith's eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. Grant sat behind her looking exhausted and pale. Financial panic had hollowed him completely now. The courtroom itself remained small and quiet. Local reporters occupied the back rows after rumors spread about the Alexander estate dispute and possible financial misconduct. Sheriff Ellen Parker stood near the rear wall observing silently. As Claudia entered, whispers moved softly through the room. That was her. Robert Alexander's widow. The woman from Ashford Hollow. Months earlier, attention like this would have humiliated Claudia. Today, she simply kept walking. Judge Amelia Carter entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone rose. The hearing began immediately. Derek Hanley stood first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this matter concerns temporary estate confusion complicated by emotional distress following Robert Alexander's recent passing." Emotional distress. Claudia almost laughed bitterly. He spoke about her grief as though it were evidence against her. Derek continued carefully. "Mrs. Alexander disappeared unexpectedly while in vulnerable condition and has since been influenced by incomplete historical documents connected to a rural property." Judge Carter adjusted her glasses. "You're referring to Ashford Hollow Farm?" "Yes, Your Honor." Derek glanced briefly toward Meredith before continuing. "The property has always remained under Alexander family management." Judge Whitmore rose calmly from Claudia's side of the courtroom. "Respectfully, that statement is disputed by documented trust records." He handed copies forward to the clerk. The courtroom shifted instantly. Judge Carter reviewed the papers carefully while silence settled over the room. Claudia watched Meredith's posture tighten beside Derek. Fear, real fear this time, not anger, because paper trails do not care about performance. Judge Carter looked up. These documents indicate protected trust holdings associated with Evelyn Brooks. Claudia's throat tightened, hearing her mother's name spoken aloud inside a courtroom. For so many years, Evelyn Brooks existed only as a tired woman, forgotten by history. Now, the truth was finally entering public record. Derek cleared his throat. The validity of those records has not yet been fully established. Judge Whitmore remained calm. Then, perhaps we should discuss the surveillance documentation and financial transfer patterns tied to Meredith Caldwell and Mr. Hanley during Robert Alexander's illness. Meredith visibly stiffened. Grant lowered his eyes immediately. The judge's gaze sharpened. What surveillance documentation? Sheriff Parker stepped forward and handed additional files to the court clerk. The room grew quieter with every page distributed. Photographs, bank transfers, copied signatures, private investigator reports, Robert's handwritten notes. Claudia watched the expressions change around the courtroom one by one. Confusion, concern, suspicion, and finally, understanding. Judge Carter reviewed several pages slowly. Then she looked directly toward Meredith. Ms. Caldwell, were you aware your father had documented concerns regarding financial pressure before his death? Meredith's composure cracked slightly. My father was sick. That was not my question. Silence. Meredith looked toward Derek instinctively. For years, she controlled situations by speaking faster, louder, more confidently than everyone else. But facts slowed everything down. Facts demanded answers, and answers trapped liars. He was under stress, Meredith finally said. People say irrational things during terminal illness. Claudia suddenly stood. The movement surprised even her. Judge Carter looked up. Mrs. Alexander Claudia's knees trembled violently beneath her coat, but she remained standing. Yes, Your Honor. Would you like to speak? Every instinct inside Claudia screamed to sit back down. Avoid attention. Avoid confrontation. Stay small. But then she remembered Robert's final recording. You were never the outsider in this family. Claudia inhaled slowly, then spoke. For 38 years, she said softly, my husband protected everyone around him, even when they hurt him. The courtroom fell silent. He loved Meredith very much, Claudia continued carefully. That's why he kept excusing things that frightened him. Meredith looked away immediately. Claudia noticed. And I spent years believing silence kept peace inside our family. Her voice shook now. But silence only protected people willing to abuse it. Grant closed his eyes. The sentence hit him harder than Meredith, because deep down Grant knew exactly when compromise became corruption. Claudia reached into her bag slowly, then removed Evelyn Brooks' letters. My mother helped save Ashford Hollow before I was born, she said quietly. She never asked for recognition. She never told anyone because she believed kindness should not come with conditions. Judge Carter accepted the letters carefully. Tears burned behind Claudia's eyes now. But Robert believed the truth mattered, even when it hurt. The judge read silently for several moments, then looked toward Meredith again. Did you previously know trust protections involving Evelyn Brooks existed? Meredith hesitated. 1 second. 2. Too long. The judge noticed immediately. I asked a direct question. Meredith's voice sharpened defensively. I knew there were old records, but Dad exaggerated everything near the end. Judge Carter leaned back slowly, and yet Mr. Hanley continued assisting with accelerated asset transfers despite disputed ownership structures. Derek immediately straightened. I acted under client direction. Whose direction, the judge asked. Silence. Grant stared downward at the floor. Because suddenly everyone understood the real problem. Not grief, not inheritance confusion. Greed. Judge Carter reviewed several more documents before speaking again. Pending full investigation, this court is ordering immediate suspension of contested estate transfers. Meredith's face lost color instantly. All disputed financial movements connected to Robert Alexander's final medical period will undergo formal review. Grant looked physically ill now. And regarding Ashford Hollow Farm, the judge continued, the court recognizes Mrs. Claudia Alexander as possessing documented legal interests tied to protected trust holdings. The words echoed through the courtroom. Legal interest recognized. For the first time in her life, Claudia felt visible. Not tolerated, not pitied, not temporarily allowed space, recognized. Meredith suddenly stood. This is unbelievable. Judge Carter's expression hardened immediately. Sit down, Miss Caldwell. But Meredith was unraveling now. She manipulated him. Meredith snapped, pointing toward Claudia. After my mother died, she inserted herself into everything. The courtroom stiffened uncomfortably. And then Claudia saw it. Not hatred, not even greed. A wounded little girl still trapped inside an aging woman. Meredith never forgave loss. She simply searched for someone to blame. Claudia felt sorrow unexpectedly rise inside her chest. Not triumph, never triumph. Because broken families leave damage everywhere, Judge Carter ended the hearing 30 minutes later. Assets frozen. Estate investigation expanded. Temporary protection orders issued. As people slowly exited the courtroom, reporters gathered near the doors whispering eagerly. But Claudia barely noticed them. She stood quietly beside the courtroom windows while snow drifted softly outside Ashford Hollow. Judge Whitmore approached her gently. You did well. Claudia looked down at her trembling hands. I was terrified. Yes, he answered softly. And you stood anyway. Across the room, Meredith left quickly with Derek while Grant lingered behind several painful seconds longer. Then finally, he looked toward Claudia. Not angrily, ashamed. Because somewhere along the way, he realized greed had destroyed everything before they even reached the courtroom. Claudia watched them disappear into the snowy afternoon. Then she closed her eyes briefly. For the first time since Robert's funeral, she no longer felt erased. The truth had finally spoken aloud. And this time, the world listened. By early spring, Ashford Hollow looked alive again. Snow melted into soft green fields. Wildflowers pushed through the earth beside broken fence posts, and sunlight finally reached corners of the farmhouse that had spent years buried beneath cold silence. Claudia Alexander stood on the front porch one quiet morning, holding a cup of coffee, while wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time in months, the property no longer felt haunted. It felt healing. The legal investigations continued in Baltimore long after the county hearing ended. Derek Hanley surrendered his law license before formal disciplinary review concluded. Several financial transfers tied to Robert Alexander's final illness were officially ruled fraudulent. Grant Caldwell's failing development company collapsed beneath debt investigations and frozen accounts. And Meredith disappeared from public view almost entirely. Some people in town called it karma. Others called it tragedy. Claudia called it grief left untreated for too long. Because despite everything Meredith had done, Claudia could not erase one painful truth. Robert's daughter had once been a little girl who lost her mother too young and never learned how to survive loss without turning it into anger. That understanding did not excuse betrayal, but it softened hatred. And Claudia refused to let hatred become the final inheritance Robert left behind. One afternoon, several weeks after the hearing, Grant arrived alone at Ashford Hollow. Claudia saw his truck near the gate while planting herbs beside the restored greenhouse. He looked older now, smaller somehow, as though failure finally stripped away the illusion of control he spent years pretending to possess. "I'm not here to fight," he said quietly after approaching the garden. Claudia wiped dirt gently from her hands. "I know." Grant stared toward the farmhouse for several moments before speaking again. "She blames everyone except herself." Claudia lowered her eyes sadly. "How is," Meredith Grant laughed once under his breath. "Angry, humiliated, terrified, then more quietly broken." The word lingered painfully between them. Grant reached into his coat pocket and removed a small cassette tape. "She asked me to throw this away after Robert died," he admitted. "I couldn't do it." Claudia recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. Final recording. Her chest tightened. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Grant looked away. "Because I spent too many years helping lies survive." The honesty in his voice surprised her. For the first time since meeting him, Grant Caldwell sounded exhausted enough to tell the truth. Before leaving, he paused near the porch steps. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Not polished, not strategic, real. Then he drove away. Claudia stood alone holding Robert's final tape while spring sunlight warmed the fields around Ashford Hollow. That evening, she carried the cassette player onto the restored greenhouse porch. The structure looked completely different now. New glass panels reflected golden sunset light. Fresh soil filled the planting beds. Children from town sometimes visited after school to help with flowers and vegetables. Life had returned to the place Robert once used to hide from pain. Claudia pressed play gently. Static crackled softly. Then Robert's voice filled the greenhouse one final time. "Hello, sweetheart." Tears instantly blurred Claudia's vision. "If you're hearing this recording," Robert continued gently, "then you survived the worst part already." Outside wind moved softly through the fields. "I know you probably wish I had told you everything sooner." Claudia closed her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Robert's voice weakened slightly on the tape. "But I spent most of my life trying to prevent storms instead of preparing people to survive them." A sad smile touched Claudia's face. That sounded exactly like him. "I thought protecting you meant carrying burdens alone," Robert admitted. "I understand now that secrecy became its own kind of harm." The greenhouse fell silent except for the tape recorder turning softly. Then Robert continued. "Your mother once told my father something I never forgot." Claudia listened carefully. "She said dignity is not something other people grant you. It's something you remember about yourself after the world tries to take it away." Tears rolled slowly down Claudia's cheeks. All her life, she waited for acceptance, for permission, for reassurance that she belonged. And somehow in the final chapter of her life, she finally understood what Evelyn Brooks had tried to teach without words. Worth does not disappear simply because cruel people refuse to see it. "You were never weak, Claudia," Robert whispered on the tape. "You were simply kind in a world that mistakes kindness for surrender." The last sunlight of evening spilled warmly across the greenhouse floor. "And if Ashford Hollow blooms again someday," Robert continued softly, "I hope it becomes a place where forgotten people remember they still matter." The recording clicked softly to an end. Claudia sat alone for a long time afterward, not drowning in grief anymore, not consumed by anger, simply remembering. Months later, the farmhouse officially reopened under a new name, the Evelyn Brooks Widows Fund. Women arrived quietly at first. An elderly teacher abandoned after medical debt. A widow forced from her home by distant relatives. A grandmother sleeping in her car after losing her apartment. Claudia welcomed each of them personally. No judgment, no humiliation, Only warmth, meals, legal support, and temporary shelter. The greenhouse became the heart of everything. People planted flowers there again. Tomatoes, lavender, wild roses. Children laughed beside rows of herbs where broken glass once covered the floor. And every spring morning Claudia walked the property, remembering how close she came to disappearing quietly into someone else's version of her life. But she did not disappear. She survived. One warm evening, nearly a year after Robert's funeral, Claudia stood alone beside the old farmhouse gate, watching sunset spill gold across Ashford Hollow. The same fields, once buried beneath silence, now carried life everywhere she looked. Judge Whitmore approached slowly from the porch. "You built something remarkable here," he said. Claudia smiled softly. "No," she answered. "My mother did." The old judge nodded gently. Then, together they watched wind move through the blooming fields while evening light settled over Ashford Hollow Farm. And for the first time in many years, Claudia Alexander no longer felt like the widow people tried to erase. She felt like herself. A woman shaped by loss, strengthened by truth, and finally home.